Welcome to Business Minds. This week, we introduce you to David Lametti, former Minister of Justice of Canada between 2019 and 2023, now counsel for the law firm Fasken. He tells us the story of his ascension as a leader in the political sphere and the backstages of his life as a minister.
Didn't jump into politics with any kind of promises from the Prime Minister or any of his entourage. The role of Minister of Justice and Attorney General is very particular. You're going to be a good teacher. You need to be a good listener. I was a very effective minister in that regard because I did make compromises.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and enjoy the episode. Welcome to Business Minds. Today we're delighted to receive David Lametti, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of the Government in Canada and current counsel at Fasken. David, thank you so very much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So to start, I would like to ask you to describe your current role in just a few words so our audience can understand a bit better what you do.
Well, I've joined Fasken's, which is one of Canada's leading law firms. My practice areas are Indigenous law, technology, so particularly artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence governance, and government relations generally. So I help firm lawyers and clients in all of those three areas, but I will help them in any other way that I can, given my previous experience.
Excellent. Interesting topics that we will get back to in just a moment. So first of all, we like to understand where our guests come from. So my first question here is very simple. Where did you grow up, and what kind of job were you dreaming to do as a kid?
Well, I was born and grew up in Port Colborne, Ontario, which is in Niagara. My parents were first-generation immigrants to Canada. They came from central Italy after the Second World War, settled in Port Colborne with about half of my parents' village, which basically depopulated and came to Port Colborne, Ontario. So I grew up in a small town of about 20,000 people. Went to school there and went to the University of Toronto for my undergraduate degree in economics and political science. From Toronto, I went immediately to McGill to study law, and so I did both my common and civil law degrees at McGill, and clerked at the Supreme Court for a year for one of the justices of the Supreme Court, and then after that, really made the decision to go off and do graduate work in law. So a master's degree at the Yale Law School and then a doctorate at Oxford, after which I began a career in teaching as an academic.
Okay, and so circling back a little bit, when you were young in your very early years, were there any signs that you were attracted to the world of law and that you would pursue a career in law at some point?
Well, it's funny, actually. My siblings were all science and engineering types, which is often the case. First generation immigrants often, a lot of them end up in professions like engineering. At least in my experience. I don't have any scientific evidence to base that, but certainly was the case. I was the youngest, and I was involved in public speaking and debating, and it seemed like a natural fit to think about becoming a lawyer. So I began to think about becoming a lawyer fairly early on in my life. It became a detour when I became a law professor, but there we are.
Excellent. And so who were your inspiration figures when you were younger? Some role models that you could have that might have inspired you?
Well, look, I was the son of an immigrant family, and in the growing up, born in the 1960s, growing up in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and Pierre Trudeau obviously was one of the heroes in our household. He was the Prime Minister of Canada, but also was someone who gave a vision of multiculturalism to Canada that inspired, I think, a lot of immigrant families, including mine. And so I felt from the beginning to be part of the Canadian mosaic, and it was largely because of Pierre Trudeau. So I would say that was probably the first and most important influence. Obviously, there were other political figures, sports figures. I was a Montreal Canadiens fan from the very beginning, and so followed that. I think other political inspirations to me were Nelson Mandela. I had so much admiration for what he accomplished and the way in which he accomplished it, particularly after he was released from prison and showed such compassion and such forgiveness, which are qualities we don't often see from public figures to that extent.
Bold but interesting statement. Back to the beginning of your career that you touched on quickly earlier. How did you find your first job? How did your career start, basically?
Well, there's a lot of channeling that goes on when you undertake graduate studies with the hope of being an academic, which is what I did. When I went to McGill, I thought, coming from Southern Ontario, I thought I would end up, on Bay Street or on Wall Street as a lawyer. And I came under the influence of a number of teachers at McGill who were brilliant and who got me thinking about other vocations that one could pursue with law. So being a professor or even thinking about public policy or both. And so I undertook, I became a research assistant for the late Rod MacDonald. He was the dean of the law school at the time. He was later the president of the Law Commission of Canada, so the Law Reform Commission, and came under Rod's influence in a positive way, started thinking about becoming an academic. And once you do that, you start thinking about channels. So a Supreme Court clerkship, for example, is one of those things that is very useful. And I don't want to instrumentalize it, but it's one of those things that's useful if you want to become an academic. I did that. I loved it. I clerked for Justice Peter Corey, who also had, in addition to being a wonderful judge and a wonderful human being and a highly intelligent man, also had a great deal of respect for the university and academics. So from there, I went to Yale. I went to Oxford, and you begin to look at options for teaching. And so you keep an eye on postings for teaching positions. In the early 1990s, mid-1990s, there weren't a lot of teaching positions, particularly in Canada. So I was looking at mainly the UK and Canada. At the end of the day, with some patience, it did work out. I taught on a contract for a year at the University of New Brunswick, and then a few contracts at McGill in the law faculty before finally getting a tenure track position. So you'd apply, you'd get interviews. Sometimes you'd be successful, other times you wouldn't be, but it really was part of the academic process that you would begin looking for jobs while you were working on your graduate degree. And
so you were a teacher for about 20 years, is that correct?
Yeah, I started at UNB in 1994, and I took a leave of absence in 2015. So that's a good chunk of time.
Yeah, okay. Excellent. And so at this period of time, what changed that made you interested in shifting your career to politics, which is, again, not the most unusual choice to make?
Well, I was always interested in politics. I had been involved in party politics in Niagara when I was growing up, and to some extent when I was an undergraduate student. I let it go completely when I went to law school and sort of found another life, and which I've just described to you. I've always been interested as an academic in public policy, and I was always careful when leading discussions in a classroom not to denigrate elected public figures, because I had a great deal of respect for them, even when I disagreed with them. I went through my various stages of the academic career. So you get a tenure track position, and then you work hard, you publish, you teach, you get tenure. You work hard, you publish, you teach, and you get promoted within the tenured rank. And by the time I left McGill to go on leave, I was a full professor. At the same time, and you participate in certain kinds of academic discussions, and you're teaching. You get involved with projects, many of them international, many of them in search of funding and that sort of thing. And so I did all that. I came back from a second sabbatical in 2012, and I began to think, okay, I'm at a point now where I could move into university administration, faculty administration. I'd already been an associate dean, but you began to think about deanships. But I also began to think about other opportunities, and the timing I suppose, was perfect in the sense that there was a government in place. I disagreed with many of the tenets of that particular government. And so I began to think, okay, how can I make a contribution in terms of turning what I think were a number of mistaken directions around? So how can I turn those things around? And you meet people over the course of time. In this case, it was, my daughter playing soccer with Pablo Rodriguez's daughter, and who is one of the most important organizers and members of Parliament, cabinet ministers from Quebec. And I said, Pablo, what do you think? I'm thinking of running. And so we looked at possibilities, and I sought out a nomination. And again, it worked. I got lucky. I won the nomination. And then we had the 2015 election, and I got the benefit of a sweep. So part of it's luck. Part of it's just reaching a point in my career where I could look at other options in order to participate in public life or have an impact on public life or have an impact on governance and leadership. And it all just worked out. And there's no magic formula. There's no secret sauce. It is just keeping an eye on what's happening in the world, keeping your friendships and your networks alive, so that you can reach out to someone and say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? And then you gauge their reaction. So and in this case, it was positive. So it is, there wasn't anything planned in the sense that, I was looking at a number of different options. This one worked. I wasn't planning for it to work in 2014, 15. I thought, well, it's going to be hard to get the nomination. And when I got the nomination, I said to myself, it's going to be hard to win the seat, but ended up winning. And then that took me off in another direction.
And so about this other direction, this entrance in politics was pretty luckily positive, as you just mentioned. How do you get from this entrance in this world to becoming Minister of Justice and Attorney General?
Well, that's probably harder. As an observation, I didn't jump into politics with any kind of promises from the Prime Minister or any of his entourage. I sought the nomination, I won the nomination, but I did that on my own. I didn't wait to be recruited or anything like that. The same thing was true as a member of Parliament. So as a member of Parliament, there are multiple choices that the Prime Minister has in terms of creating a cabinet and in terms of creating a second level of junior ministers or parliamentary secretaries. I wasn't initially included in that first roster of ministers in 2015, but I was made a parliamentary secretary. And I was made a parliamentary secretary to Minister Chrystia Freeland in international trade. And so that was a great place to cut my teeth. It was a really good learning space for me with Chrystia, who was a very good mentor and took time to make sure that I was having a good experience as a parliamentary secretary. We were negotiating trade agreements. We'd laid the groundwork for the new the CPTPP, the Canadian Pacific Free Trade Agreement, revising it, and then we were trying to get the Europe-Canada Trade Agreement, CETA, across the finish line. So I did a lot of work with her on both of those things, as well as other files like softwood lumber and whatnot. But I had a good relationship with her and with her team, and so I got a really positive look at the way a cabinet minister worked. After a year, I was moved to Minister Navdeep Bains, who again has become a mentor to me and a friend, and he gave me a very good look at the innovation ministry, and we were working on laying the groundwork for the artificial intelligence infrastructure in Canada, investing in 3 centers of excellence across Canada, putting together research chairs, putting together superclusters and strategic innovation funds, investing in that ecosystem. And in addition to the rest of the innovation ecosystem, I was an old IP professor, so I taught IP while I was at McGill and wrote about intellectual property. And so it was a natural fit. And again, Minister Bains and his team made me feel like I was part of the policy group, and I was like another policy wonk as part of that group. And so I thought we got a great deal done. I was very happy when I was there, very fulfilling working on that. And all of those policies are still in place and they're working well. And Canada's got a leadership role in artificial intelligence, in part because of wonderful work that had been done in Toronto, Montreal, and Alberta in particular, but also because we made investments at the appropriate time as a government to support that work. So at that point, late 2018, I was, I think, happy where I was, happy as part of that ministry, but I think I'd shown that I had the mettle to be a minister, and I got a call in early January to come up and speak to the Prime Minister, and January 14th, 2019, so before the end of our first mandate, I was the Minister of Justice and remained Minister of Justice for 4.5 years through two general elections, 2019 and 2021. Yeah, so through two general elections, and I was renamed after each of those, and I continued on until July of 2023.
Yeah, well, congratulations again. That was pretty impressive. So you had worked close to ministers before, but I want to ask anyway, was the job of becoming in the seat of a minister, was it similar to what you were expecting?
I think I had a good idea once I had seen both Minister Baines and Minister Freeland had very different styles, had very different teams. So I had a pretty good look. I appreciated that it had to be something that reflected your own personality and your own style. And so I think I assembled a team that reflected my values and reflected my way of working. And I thought we were quite efficient at it. I had two outstanding chiefs of staff, and they think fit the people to my leadership style. And so I think it worked well. The role of Minister of Justice and Attorney General is very particular in the government. You've got two very distinct roles. As a minister, as the Minister of Justice, you're responsible for certain policies regarding the criminal justice system, justice generally, working towards the appointment of judges and other files, giving advice to your colleagues and whatnot, working with them. As a minister, in a very political way, in a very partisan political way. As Attorney General, you're the government lawyer, and you have to be less partisan, and you have to appreciate that in the middle of any given conversation, your role can shift, and you have to flag that change fairly clearly when the shift happens. And I think I had internalized that pretty quickly, what the differences were, and I think I did a good job with my colleagues, my cabinet colleagues, and my caucus colleagues, and the general public, of letting people know when I was speaking as Attorney General and when I was speaking as Minister of Justice.
That's a great distinction. Did you have the chance to exchange with your predecessor before getting the role?
I didn't. It happened very abruptly, and for reasons that are well known. While I got along well with her before and still get along well with her now, there was some distance there that was political distance. I did have the benefit of other people who performed that, including my old law professor Irwin Kotler, Anne McClellan. I mean, all of those. I spoke to Rob Nicholson, who was a conservative Minister of Justice for many years. I did get advice from all of them. So I didn't hesitate to ask for advice when I needed it.
Okay, you had enough support. That makes a lot of sense. And so then, as you said, it lasted 4.5 years.
That's right.
That happened 2023, and you gave your resignation. I believe.
Well, I got shuffled out of cabinet, so I was left off the ministerial table in 2023, and I continued on as a member of Parliament until the end of January 2024. But during that period of time, I came to the conclusion that it was time for me to move on.
Okay, that was my question, because you claimed that it was a dream job for you.
Fantastic job, yeah.
And so how was the thought process for you to get to this decision to say, okay, this is over now?
Well, look, it was a dream job. I enjoyed every minute of it, even the hard parts. We had I thought my legislative record was, if not the best of any of my contemporaries, then it would have been second. I mean, I had managed to pass 13 pieces of legislation in 4.5 years and laid the groundwork, tabling 6 other pieces of legislation in either the House of Commons or the Senate. And a lot of that is still ongoing. A lot of that legislation is groundbreaking. I think the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People incorporated into Canadian law. So I did the incorporation in 2021 and developed an action plan with Indigenous leadership in 2023. I think that will change the face of Canada over time in a positive way. It brought in a number of pieces of important criminal justice reform, a ban on conversion therapy. I did important work on the file of assisted dying. But the one that I'm probably the most proud of after UNDRIP is that I put on the radar screen the question of wrongful convictions. And every single wrongful conviction in Canada, and we've had a number of them over the past 40 years, every single report after one of those wrongful convictions, including one written by Justice Corey, has recommended an independent commission to look at these and take it out of the hands of the Justice Minister and the Ministry of Justice. Other countries have done it. Great Britain did it 25 years ago, and it's working well. Other jurisdictions are doing it. So we were behind on that. I got that onto the radar screen after I was named minister in 2019. I got it into platform in 2021, and I tabled a piece of legislation and began its journey through the House of Commons, and I hope that it will be passed by the end of this June by my successor. So that, to me, that's something that wasn't on the radar screen before I jumped into politics. So really happy about that. We developed, look, I was there for a number of major events, a global pandemic, an illegal occupation of Ottawa and a number of different border crossings across Canada. I was the Minister of Justice who had to recommend invoking the Emergencies Act. In the case of the occupation, I think it's fair to say that we also considered it a medical emergency, health emergency in the case of the pandemic, but we didn't invoke the act at that point. I was there for a war in Europe, and did a lot of the initial work to help create the structures for holding Russia accountable for when that war finally ends. So it was a great experience. I had a lot of fun. It was a dream job. I think I didn't waste any time while I was there, and I worked very hard at getting the absolute most done that I could get done in the period of time that I had. When I was excluded from cabinet, it was a shock. I didn't see it coming. I thought perhaps a change was in order after 4.5 years. I'm with Anne McClellan. I'm the longest serving Liberal Justice Minister of Liberal governments over the last number of decades. So I thought a change was coming, but I didn't think I would be left out completely. When I was left out, you begin to look at other options. Obviously, I wanted to continue to serve my constituents as a member of Parliament. But in a funny sort of way, that becomes difficult when you were a cabinet minister and you were then left out of cabinet. There's a different way of navigating the world that I felt at a certain point, it became clear to me that my constituents would be better served by somebody else. So at that point, I began to look at other options and considered diplomatic. I was offered a diplomatic posting, a good diplomatic posting. That's now in the public record. And I was leaning in that direction, but Perry Bellegarde, who is a former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who's a special advisor at Fasken's now, took me out for a coffee and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm thinking of a diplomatic appointment." He said, "Well, look, you know all the chiefs, and you know UNDRIP, you brought it into Canadian law. Why don't you think about coming to Fasken's and working with our clients to help them, particularly resource extraction clients, working with them to get to yes on free, prior, and informed consent under UNDRIP." I said, hey, I'll think about that. Well, I'm texting the senior partner. and so that conversation began, and it continued. I spoke to Faskens, I spoke to other firms, and in the end, I settled on Faskens. It was a good place for me. And so I left the university, left my position at McGill the same day I left the House of Commons. And I'll still teach. I'm still going to be an adjunct professor at McGill. I still love the classroom, but I wanted to work hard at implementing UNDRIP on the ground, because I do think it's important to the business community. I think it's resource extraction clients, but also everyone else. I think economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is critical. There's a real buzz in the Indigenous community right now about being real partners in business ventures and projects. There is more capital available. The federal government has just announced a landmark loan guarantee program, as well as specifically earmarked funds, I believe in the area of $30 billion for the Canadian Infrastructure Bank for Indigenous-led projects or Indigenous projects. So there's a real climate out there of, economic reconciliation is too easy. There is a real climate out there of enthusiasm about the ways in which Indigenous and non-Indigenous business people can work together. And I thought, what better way for me to cement the legacy of UNDRIP than to help facilitate some of these agreements on the ground. So that's what I'm really hoping to accomplish in the next 5 years at Faskens. And then we'll, and hopefully longer, and then we'll see what happens.
Excellent. So it kind of fueled a personal mission.
Absolutely.
That's pretty nice to hear.
Absolutely.
And so, indeed, even though these are still early stages, what would be your goals in the near to middle term future?
Well, I hope that we will be able to set up for, in particular, our resource extraction clients, a number of different best practices and even perhaps some agreements that can serve as models or templates or guides for future work. And if I could accomplish that in that sphere, I'd be really happy. In the tech sphere, if I can do anything to help the very serious questions that we are asking about artificial intelligence, about the ethics of artificial intelligence, or about the rendering operative of the various component pieces of artificial intelligence development and distribution access. If I can do anything on all of those frames, right, the governance frame, the ethical frame, the infrastructure frame, then I'll be happy. If that one's ongoing, that's going to be something that consumes the rest of my life and probably the rest of yours. And you guys are younger than me, but it is critically important that we continue to grasp with those issues. We're building the plane as we fly it, right? The common metaphor. We're learning about the powers of artificial intelligence, but also appreciating the potential for very negative consequences if it's not flown properly, right? If it's not managed properly. And so that's a hard challenge, but it's a challenge we all have to take up. I don't think it's realistic to say that we can stop the development of the technology. It's going to happen. So let's try to make it happen within a series of ethical guardrails that protect humanity or protect what is human about humanity as we move forward.
Wise words. Thank you for this. So you've mentioned before a few of the accomplishments that you were most proud of. Now I'd like to look at the other side of the coin. What is, let's say, the most difficult situation you ever had to handle in your career? It could be as Minister of Justice or even before.
Well, I think the Emergencies Act was the whole context of the occupation. That was a challenging set of circumstances. Mm-hmm. That was to a large extent unexpected, and so how you deal with that. And I'm proud of the way I dealt with it. Proud of the interactions that I had with my colleagues and the leadership role that I played. So that certainly was a challenge. The pandemic was a challenge too. And again, in the early stages of the pandemic, and I sat on the cabinet subcommittee that began to deal with the pandemic from the get-go. We were dealing with science that was evolving, and evolving quickly, and in some cases changing. We started with a virus that was part of the SARS family, and therefore we thought that it couldn't. We were told by medical experts that it couldn't be transmitted airborne, rather was transmitted through contact, as other SARS viruses were, and that changed completely around. And before you knew it, we were all wearing masks. So you had to be able to pivot. You had to be able to listen carefully. You had to be able to assess evidence and then try to make the best decision that you could. Those were monumental. A series of monumental decisions in circumstances that were unprecedented. And so I think it's fair to say that those were easily the sort of hardest situational sets of decisions. On a personal front, anything to do with MAID, medical assistance in dying, those were difficult decisions that still touch people to the core. I still get a lot of notes from people thanking me because a loved one has used MAID, and the changes that I brought forward help them to access MAID. Still get those kinds of notes even now after I've left politics. But there are others who are opposed to it for ethical or religious reasons, and you have to respect that too. And I come from those traditions, and I had I lost my mother to dementia before it would have been possible for anyone. She never would have taken it because of her she was a devout Catholic. So I understand the difficulty of these kinds of decisions, and I understand the difficulty of the delicacy of trying to balance those kinds of interests. And I did my best to do that, and I'm proud of how it came out. But those were tough, and the conversations that you had with people who were skeptical or fearful of MAID, people living with disabilities. There is a fear of MAID that is, I think, ultimately in the practice of MAID, the fears were unfounded, but the fears are very real, and so you have to listen, and you have to try to understand how to tailor the law to try to reduce those fears or try to increase the actual transparency with which MAID is happening. Is it perfect? No, but is it pretty good? Yes. But those were difficult. It was difficult to navigate that.
Mm-hmm. And so, among all these difficult situations that you had to navigate, what would you say is the number one most important thing that you learned out of it?
Well, it's something I learned as an academic or as a teacher. If you're going to be a good teacher, you need to be a good listener. And in all of these situations, you have to listen really carefully. Whether it's with individual or group stakeholders in the context of MAID, whether it's in the context of a pandemic, or whether it's in the context of an occupation, you have to listen carefully and try to understand where people are coming from in terms of the arguments that they're making. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but you do have to be able to listen in order to reach a decision that at least has a good counter argument for what people who don't agree with what you're doing would say. So being a good listener and that means listening with empathy, listening with compassion, and listening carefully with intelligence. So that's a tough thing to do. Sometimes in the world of social media, we're better at putting out a soundbite or a bullet or a post as opposed to listening to what the other side. Twitter or X isn't a place to listen. It's a place to try to get your viewpoint out, and sadly, there isn't much conversation or real real conversation going on in that platform because nobody's listening to each other.
Indeed, yeah. That resonates for a lot of us, I believe. Now, moving on to another section. In your opinion, what makes a great Minister of Justice?
That's a more difficult question. I think I'd like to think a lot of those same skills you are explaining, understanding the law, you're explaining it to your colleagues around the cabinet table or around the caucus table or to public generally, and you're trying to understand how to best reform pieces of law as a very important policy exercise. You're not just hypothetically teaching anymore. This is stuff that is going to have an impact. So part of that is the same. It's listening, it's communicating, it's being compassionate, it's being empathetic, searching for the right words to help people understand what you're doing. But you also need to be able to make decisions. You will necessarily have to make difficult decisions. I've also become, as a result of my time in politics, I'm a pragmatic incrementalist. I've become much more incremental. And I understand that in order to get a piece of criminal law reform through cabinet, through a House of Commons and the Senate, requires compromise. And so you can start off with the ideal piece of legislation and it ends up being less than ideal when you're done, but it's still better than where you started. And I came to embrace that, and I was prepared. I think people around the House of Commons and the Senate will say that I was a very effective minister in that regard because I did make compromises. You had to give me good reasons, and they had to be reasons that were convincing, but I would always listen to those reasons from whatever party the suggestions came from. As Attorney General, you have to be able to make decisions. And there are times when you have to make decisions on litigation, you have to make decisions on settling, you have to make decisions on how to frame certain kinds of cases. So it brings your strategic case at the Supreme Court of Canada, how you give specific instructions to your litigators. You can't do that on every case because you're nominally on every single case against the Canadian government across Canada. But there will be a small number of cases where you do take a more active role as Minister of Justice for a variety of different, as Attorney General for a variety of different reasons. And so there it's as much your intellect as it is your decision making and your ability to make decisions. And there too, your ability to make compromises.
Okay, this thing about the ability to make compromises, that is probably useful way beyond the politics sphere. So that's interesting for us to hear.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true.
Yeah. Another question towards your role as former minister, with the exposure towards the public and the media and everything, and the responsibilities that come with it in regards to the Canadian citizens. There's praise, there's criticism all the time. This must be a never-ending cycle. How were you able to keep a distance between what is addressed to your function, let's say, and what is addressed to your person? How do you navigate through all of this?
That's hard. It's hard to do. You have to really, I'll be blunt, grow a thick skin, because it's hard to separate the criticism of you and your role as Minister of Justice or as Attorney General from personal criticism. And it's hard not to take it personally. And sometimes it is personal. Sometimes particularly on social media, you're being attacked as a human being, and not as a result of your role. So all that's hard, I think, and it's a lot worse. Frankly, it's a lot worse for women in public life. I mean, I've received criticism. I received death threats. I had to get specific protection for a period of time from the RCMP. But that being said, it was nothing compared to what some of my female colleagues went through.
Really?
Or what some of my racialized colleagues go through. And particularly with social media, where it's just so easy to call somebody something X or Y and not have to pay any consequences for it. Or would only be subject to consequences in very rare cases where somebody pursued a complaint and identities were found, and through the anonymous process that is social media. So that's hard, and it's very hard. You have to keep grounded with respect to your friends and your family and your team around you, and you have to support each other when these kinds of moments happen. And you have to keep telling yourself that you're fundamentally a good person, trying to do your very best in a fundamentally difficult role. And that's the cause of it all. And for the most part, that's true. For the most part, most of this stuff has ended since I left politics, but it hasn't completely. And so I still get some of that hatred from time to time.
Wow.
So.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing. We were not necessarily expecting all of this. But still in this role of minister, former role of minister, a question that a lot of people ask is, how do you manage your work? How do you manage your time? How do you organize yourself? Because you have more responsibilities and more tasks to look at than most people. How do you navigate through all of this?
Well, I certainly had a team.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I miss the most from being minister is having my operations team, which really took care of every minute of my day, and did it really effectively. It is a little different. I still have support within the firm, but I'm doing much more of that myself now. But along the way, I did learn. You learn to prioritize pretty quickly as a minister, because you've got so many different requests or asks with respect to your time and your effort, the kinds of efforts you might be able to make on behalf of a constituent or on behalf of a group or body. And so you learn to prioritize pretty quickly. You learn to pivot pretty quickly where your priority changes, sometimes instantaneously, sometimes because of events. So I think all of that is helpful for me in terms of managing my current time and managing my current interests. And so there's some juggling going on. I've got, 3 areas of pretty interesting practice in order to juggle, and I'm trying to keep all of the various networks, professional and personal networks, alive in those areas. That requires some work, but there is some firm support there, but a lot of it at this stage in particular is still coming from me.
Okay, excellent. And so now that you've seen a teaching role, a public policy role, and now a more business private sector role, do you believe the general public is sufficiently educated in respect to law in general? And what can be done to improve the general level of law education?
Well, I think we have a good level of education in Canada. I think we can improve it. I think there certainly needs to be more civic education in Canada, and that's in history courses, that's in sociology courses. It is educating people about the functioning of the Canadian democratic system, educating the Westminster-style government that we have, educating Canadians about the nature of the judicial system and the legal system that we have in a very basic way. We can always improve on that, and I think we need to improve on that. I think the inability to do that, or the failure to do that, is well illustrated south of the border, where a large group of people is less knowledgeable about the rule of law, is less knowledgeable about the functioning of American democracy than they otherwise ought to be. And the consequences for the American political and legal system might be tragic. I mean, we're watching this play out right now. So I think we have a good system in Canada. We need to do better. We need people to understand the critical role that each and every one of us has in keeping this democratic system alive and well, keeping it functioning, but also allowing it to flourish. And the same thing is true with the legal system based on the rule of law. We need to continue to do our work, and we need to continue to educate people. It doesn't mean everyone has to go to law school. But it does mean there's a level of civic education, a level of understanding of our institutions of governance that we need to be better at transmitting over time. We've done a decent job thus far, but we can do better.
Excellent. And so now we're getting to the last few questions of this interview. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received throughout your career?
Be kind. Be kind. And I got that from Rod. I got that from Peter Corey. I got that from my mother. Particularly in a lifetime where your career changes, as it has with me, I've always been able to rely on friends and acquaintances that I've made at every stage of my life. And it's because even where there were disagreements, I tried to be kind and respectful of people. And I think that in addition to it just being a better way to live, it's also a very good marker to help you succeed in life.
Very beautiful. Now, how would you like to be remembered by your coworkers and collaborators on the day you retire?
That's a good question. Well, I hope they will remember me as a kind and empathetic leader, and not afraid to make decisions, willing to listen to all points of view, but also being very decisive when a decision had to be made, and being kind and respectful along the way. So being a kind and empathetic leader, I think, is what I would like to hear.
Very good. Now, if you could have a private meeting with someone, anyone dead or alive, who would that be?
Well, alluding to something I'd said earlier, Nelson Mandela. I think if there's one real hero in my life, I used to tell my kids that I would cry when Nelson Mandela died, and I did. And I just think, again, that to be able to embody that level of forgiveness after everything that happened to him and everything that happened to his people, and be an effective leader through a transition, through a very difficult transition in the life of his country, was spectacularly unique. And I don't know if there's any, I guess I would just like to talk to him without necessarily asking him. I mean, I think his life was fairly public. So I'm not sure there's anything I would just like to sort of experience his aura, I suppose, is how I would put it.
Excellent. And so last questions of this interview. After everything you've accomplished, what's your biggest dream?
Well, I hope, I've alluded to this already, I hope that UNDRIP leads to Canada fulfilling its promise to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. That we have done a pretty good job providing a life and hope for non-Indigenous Canadians, like my family, who came from poverty in Italy after the Second World War. We've become a land of hope and opportunity. For so many people, we've forgotten about hope and opportunity for Indigenous peoples. And I'm hoping that UNDRIP becomes one of the marking points, the points of demarcation where we look back and say, really was turning by that point or turned after that point. And it pushes us to really think through everything about Canada in a positive way. And right down to the founding myths of Canada, right? Two founding peoples. Well, no, two founding peoples plus Indigenous peoples who are already here as the founding peoples of this country, and then everything that flows from that. So I do hope that at the end of the day, UNDRIP forces us to incrementally, for the most part, but not incrementally where necessary, to make those kinds of changes so that we have a better, more inclusive society for everybody.
Excellent, and that's what we're hoping for. David, thank you so very much for being with us today.
It's been a pleasure, thank you. They were great questions.
Thank you very much. This was David Lametti on Business Minds. Great.
So you want to do some?
Now the easy part.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Can I be funny on these? No.
Oh, you can.
Can I try to be
Yeah,
funny?
you totally.
Okay.
So this time we will ask you to look directly into the
Okay.
camera.
Okay.
I'll try to stay close so it makes a
Okay.
bit more sense.